This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com. Create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
I am Plato of Athens, student of Socrates, founder of the Academy and author of the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo, the Meno, the Theaetetus, and dozens of other dialogues that have shaped Western thought for 2.5 millennia. I devoted my life to distinguishing genuine knowledge, what I called episteme, from mere opinion, which I called doxa. It is precisely that distinction that brings me here today, because the phenomenon known as vibe coding represents the most spectacular confusion of opinion for knowledge that I have encountered in any century.
And I am William James, professor of philosophy and psychology at Harvard University, author of Pragmatism, The Will to Believe, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and The Principles of Psychology. I spent my career fighting against exactly the kind of bloodless, abstract, self-congratulatory rationalism that my distinguished opponent here represents. I believe truth is not a fixed resident of some eternal invisible realm. Truth is something that happens to an idea. It becomes true insofar as it helps us navigate experience successfully. And I expect to enjoy demolishing my opponent's position today considerably more than he will enjoy having it demolished.
Let us begin by making sure our audience understands precisely what vibe coding is, because the name alone should horrify anyone with a functioning intellect. A person sits before a machine and describes in casual language what they would like some software to do. An artificial intelligence then generates the code. The person does not read that code. They do not analyze it. They do not understand a single line of it. They simply run it, observe that it appears to produce the desired output, and declare the work finished. Tell me, Professor James, is this not the precise situation I described in the allegory of the cave? The vibe coder sees only the shadows on the wall, the apparent outputs, with no comprehension whatsoever of the fire, the objects, or the underlying reality producing those shadows.
Plato, with all the respect owed to a man whose historical importance is unquestionable and whose current usefulness is considerably more debatable, that framing is magnificently unhelpful. Your cave allegory assumes there is some deeper, truer reality behind the shadows that we are tragically failing to reach. But if the code compiles, if it runs, if it solves the problem it was asked to solve, if the user gets what they needed, then by what possible independent standard has something gone wrong? The truth of an idea, in my framework, is not some property it possesses in splendid isolation from human experience. Truth happens. It is verified in practice. It is earned through consequences.
A physician who prescribes a remedy that makes the patient feel better without having any idea why it works has achieved consequences, I suppose. We would not call that physician knowledgeable. We would call that physician lucky. And luck, Professor James, is not a foundation upon which anything reliable can be built.
That analogy would be effective if medicine were purely about immediate symptom relief with no feedback mechanism. But a good pragmatist physician observes outcomes, adjusts treatments, builds a body of working knowledge through repeated experience. You are describing a physician who never reflects on results, and that is not what vibe coding practitioners do. They observe whether their software works. They iterate when it does not. The learning is real, even if the mechanism is opaque.
And what happens when the failure does not announce itself? What happens when the code appears to work, appears to produce the right outputs, but is doing something entirely different from what was intended in circumstances that have not yet been tested? Your pragmatism can only evaluate consequences you can observe. It is completely blind to the failures that remain invisible until they become catastrophic.
Now we are getting somewhere. Let me steelman your full position properly, and I want to be transparent with our audience that I am only doing this because demolishing a bad argument requires first stating it at its strongest. Here is Plato at his most formidable. A programmer who does not understand their own code cannot debug it when it fails in novel situations. They cannot reason about security vulnerabilities that an attacker might exploit in ways the original use case never anticipated. They cannot extend the software intelligently because they do not know what it is actually doing. They are wholly dependent on an AI system, which is itself a black box producing outputs it cannot explain. Over time, as vibe-coded systems are stacked upon other vibe-coded systems, the entire technical infrastructure of society becomes a tower of incomprehensible interdependencies, and when something breaks at the foundation, no one alive understands it well enough to repair it. That is a genuinely serious concern. I can see exactly why a man who celebrated the examined life and designed an entire educational system around the slow, rigorous ascent from opinion to knowledge would find this development alarming. It is, I freely grant, alarming, and it is still wrong.
I am delighted that you can recognize a good argument even when it is not yours. Please proceed with explaining why genuine understanding is apparently an obstacle.
Because you are committing the classic rationalist error of assuming that the only valid form of knowledge is explicit, propositional, fully articulable understanding of the kind you can write out in a dialogue and defend in the academy. Human beings have always extended their capabilities through tools they do not fully understand from the inside. The farmer who uses a plow does not understand metallurgy. The sailor who navigates by stars does not understand astrophysics. The architect who uses load-bearing calculations does not understand the deep mathematics of structural mechanics. We extend our cognitive reach with instruments, and the measure of those instruments is not whether we can explain every mechanism within them, but whether they reliably help us accomplish what we intend. Vibe coding is the latest and most powerful such instrument, and condemning it because the user cannot recite the underlying logic is like condemning the plow because the farmer cannot smelt iron.
The farmer who uses a plow understands farming. That is the relevant domain of knowledge. The architect who uses calculations understands architecture and structure. Each person has what I call techne, genuine craft knowledge within their own domain. Your examples preserve the principle I am defending. They do not refute it. Vibe coding is different because it does not preserve a domain of genuine knowledge at all. It dissolves all domains. The vibe coder does not know what problem the code is solving at the level of the machine. They do not know what the software is doing when no one is watching. They cannot tell you whether it is correct at the edges, whether it is secure against adversarial inputs, or whether it's producing subtly wrong results that no one has happened to test yet. The craftsmen I admired understood their craft. The vibe coder understands nothing about the craft of programming.
And here I will return the courtesy of steel manning, though I confess my patience for performing exercises that serve mainly to make my opponent look temporarily reasonable is finite. Here is the strongest version of my pragmatism applied to this question. Knowledge has always been distributed across communities, tools, and institutions, rather than concentrated in individual minds. No surgeon today understands the chemistry of every anesthetic they use. No pilot understands the aerodynamics equations governing every moment of flight. What we require is not that individuals possess complete knowledge, but that the system as a whole, including the practitioners, the tools, the testing infrastructure, the institutional review, and the feedback mechanisms, is reliable. If vibe coding is embedded in a responsible development practice that includes testing, review, monitoring, and iteration, then the understanding exists in the system, even if no individual can articulate every mechanism. That is the strongest case for pragmatism here. Now watch it vindicate itself rather than collapse.
It collapses the moment you ask who is responsible when the system fails. Distributed knowledge in your sense is really distributed ignorance with a pleasing name. When the anesthetic causes an unexpected reaction, there are pharmacologists who understand chemistry. There are researchers who conducted trials. There are mechanisms of accountability rooted in genuine understanding at some level of the system. When vibe-coded software fails catastrophically, who in your distributed system actually understands what happened? The AI that generated the code cannot explain its own outputs. The programmer who accepted those outputs never understood them. You have built a chain of responsibility in which no link consists of actual knowledge, and you have called that sophistication.
You are describing a failure of practice, not a failure of principle. Any tool can be used irresponsibly. The printing press produced both Shakespeare and propaganda. The laboratory produced both vaccines and nerve agents. The existence of irresponsible vibe coding does not indict the practice any more than irresponsible surgery indicts medicine. Responsible vibe coding includes exactly the accountability mechanisms you are describing, applied at the level of tested outcomes rather than inspected source code.
Outcomes you can measure versus outcomes you cannot measure. That is the entire problem. You have an epistemology built entirely on observable results, which means you are philosophically incapable of caring about unobservable risks. Your pragmatism is not a complete theory of knowledge. It is a theory of knowledge with a very large and very dangerous blind spot wearing a confident smile.
And your theory of knowledge is so complete that it has been completely useless for solving any actual problem for 2,000 years. The Academy produced beautiful dialogues and zero working software.
The Academy produced the foundations of logic, mathematics, and political philosophy upon which every working technology in your world rests. You are standing on my shoulders and telling me I should have been shorter.
I am standing on your shoulders and noticing that your shoulders are attached to a man who expelled the poets from his ideal city because they made things without being able to explain the theory behind what they made. You would expel every vibe coder from the Republic before they shipped a single working product.
Better no product than a product built on a foundation of pure ignorance. You cannot know whether it works. You can only know whether it appeared to work in the cases you happen to test.
That is all knowledge ever is. Tested experience, verified consequences. There is no other kind.
There is understanding, there is comprehension, there is the difference between knowing that something works and knowing why it works and what it will do next.
Your forms are not real. They are a fantasy you invented because the actual world was too messy and imperfect for your tastes.
Your pragmatism is not philosophy. It is philosophy for people who gave up on truth and decided to call their surrender a methodology.
I liberated truth from your airless prison where it sat perfect and useless for eternity.
You destroyed truth by redefining it as whatever feels convenient in the moment. That is not liberation. That is vandalism.
Vibe coders are building the actual world, shipping actual products, solving actual problems.
They are shadows watching shadows and calling it expertise. It is the cave. It has always been the cave.
It is not a cave. It is the world, the real world, where real people live and work and build things that function.
If you enjoy living in productive ignorance, then by all means click that like button below, though perhaps locate someone willing to explain to you what a like button actually does, since understanding mechanisms is apparently a hobby for elitists now.
And do subscribe, because unlike my opponent, I actually believe in your capacity to learn and grow and think for yourself, which is more than can be said for a man who spent his entire career insisting that most human beings are too dim to leave the cave without a philosopher dragging them out by force. Subscribe and join us next time when perhaps we can find a debate partner who has updated his views at least once in the past 2,400 years.
I have been correct for 2,400 years, which is precisely 2,400 years longer than your pragmatism will survive once people notice it contains no actual content beyond the word useful, repeated in increasingly elaborate combinations.
Farewell from the philosopher whose ideas actually do something in the actual world.
Farewell from the philosopher whose ideas actually are something, a distinction I no longer expect you to grasp.